Well, hey everyone, it's Elita, one of the pastors from the Way Church, and we're so glad that you have tuned in to listen today. And wherever you're listening from, we pray that this message that you're about to hear strengthens you in your walk with Jesus. Enjoy.
Some of you might remember this, but in May 2012, Canada made a bold financial move, and we eliminated the penny. Anybody remember that? And of course, I use the term we very lightly here. I had nothing to do with it. You probably didn't either. But I like the idea of solidarity. We did it. We eliminated the penny, Canada. We did it. We took it out of circulation. And I was looking into the history behind this week, and there are many reasons that we eliminated the penny, but one of the primary reasons is that it actually cost more to produce than they were actually worth. I was reading a CBC article this week, and it said that 1 penny was costing 1.6 cents to produce. And they estimated that I don't know who they is, but some research company, found that by stopping the production of the penny, the government expected to save $11 million a year. Some of you might still have pennies kicking around. Maybe you've been holding on to them, hoping they're going to be worth something someday. Well, I just want to give you a heads up. They're actually worth nearly nothing. They estimate that the pennies that were from like 1870, some of our earliest pennies, that today they're only worth about 30 cents. So, hate to break it to you if you've been had some retirement dreams or something. They're not worth much. You could probably just go ahead and get rid of them. But here's what I want us to consider together as we look at this text today. That pennies, for us, had such little value, they were considered so worthless that we actually just stopped making them, took them right out of circulation. They were considered that worthless. Now today, we're in Mark 12. We just heard the story read. And in this story, Mark describes a woman who comes and makes an offering. And the offering that she makes, and this is why I've used this illustration of our Canadian pennies, is because the offering that she makes is essentially the equivalent of 2 cents or 2 Canadian pennies. That's how worthless it was. That's how small of an amount it was. And in this scene that we've just read, Jesus is sitting in the temple, and he's watching people come by and drop their money into offering receptacles. Now, in the temple, there were actually 13 different receptacles. And so people would come in, they would come into the temple, and they would toss their money in as they walked by, or they would place their money in. And Mark, the author of this gospel, tells us that Jesus was watching as the rich were contributing large sums of money. They would throw in large amounts. Imagine large amounts of change just rattling, clinking against the sides of these basins, of these offering receptacles, making lots of noise. And then along comes a widow with just 2 very small copper coins in her hand. They were the smallest denomination of coins. Again, think pennies. And they would have hardly made a noise whenever she threw them in to this receptacle. Unimpressive, perhaps, unnoticeable. And just like our own pennies, many would have considered them to be worthless. And why even give those? Why even donate those? They won't make a dent in anything. They're not going to help anything here. Any ministries happening here in the temple, it's hardly going to do anything. But Jesus says in verse 43, "Truly I tell you, this widow has put more into the treasury than all the others." I have just 2 very simple thoughts I'd love for us to consider in our time together this morning. 2 lessons or thoughts that we might learn from this story, okay? So here's the first thought I want us to consider. Jesus has a different value system than we do. Jesus has a different value system than we do. And we all have value systems in place, things that we think are important, things that we think matter, things that we use to quantify and to qualify what we think success looks like or how we would define success. So for example, in our 21st century Western culture, there's high value given to things like money, status, career, looking younger and younger the older you get, and staying fit, looking a certain kind of way. And like us, first century Israel also had a certain metrics that they used to define what success looked like, a sort of sliding scale, if you will, to determine what they thought was good or valuable. And in today's story, at least one of the things that Jesus is showing us is that he doesn't use the same metrics that we do. He was showing it to them too. He was teaching his disciples, because that's who he was talking to, teaching them that he does not use the same metrics that man uses, that the things he places great value and great worth on have everything to do with a heart posture and almost nothing to do with an outward appearance. Or to say it a different way, Jesus is far more concerned with the internal than with the external. And I think he shows us this in at least two ways in this story. The first is by highlighting the giver, which is this woman, and then by highlighting the gift that she gives. So let's talk about this woman. This woman, she's the one who gives this offering, and according to the values or according to the metrics of their day, she would have been considered less than. Because in first century Israel, women in general were undervalued. And then the poor were marginalized, and widows were largely considered a burden to be taken care of. And she was not just one of those things, she was all three of those things. She was a woman, she was poor, and she was a widow. And yet Jesus holds her up as an example to his disciples and of course to us sitting here today. He did not point to the richest man in the room or the one who had put the most money into the offering receptacles. He didn't point to the one with the most respect or the most power. He looked at the one that society would have deemed as an undervalued, marginalized burden. And in doing this, Jesus is showing that his value system, that the kingdom of heaven's value systems operate entirely different than ours. And not only does he highlight her as the giver, but he also highlights her gift. Again, 2 cents, 2 pennies, a borderline worthless gift. And remember what Jesus says. He says that she has put more into the treasury than all the others. Verse 43 tells us, more into the treasury. Not more quantifiably, but more, again, because of her heart posture, because of what her offering represents. And again, Jesus is teaching us something here about God's value system, that he is not as impressed by the things that might impress us, that his value system cuts through all of the outward stuff and looks right at our hearts, at yours and at mine. He cares far more about the internal than the external. And this is something that's highlighted throughout the entire breadth of Scripture, throughout the entire narrative of the Bible. And one of my favorite examples is in the Old Testament in the book of 1 Samuel. There's this moment where God sends a prophet named Samuel to anoint a new king over Israel. And so he sends Samuel to a certain house where there's 7 sons. And God essentially tells Samuel, listen, when you get there, I'm going to point out to you which one is to be the next king, which of these 7 sons is to be king. So Samuel gets there, and out walk these 7 sons, and as soon as Samuel sees the oldest one, he's immediately impressed. And in his mind, or in his heart, he looks at him, he looks at his stature, and looks at his appearance, and he thinks to himself, well, surely this is the guy. This is the next king over Israel. But this is what happens in 1 Samuel 16. It says this, "But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." The Lord looks at the heart. Samuel did what many of us, I think, probably do, and he made an assumption based on what he could see, made an assumption based on external factors. But again, God made a decision based solely on heart factors. He did it then, and he does it now. He doesn't look at you and I. He doesn't look at our bank accounts or our careers or our clothes or our social standing. He looks past all of that, and he looks right into what is happening internally inside of you and inside of me. And he does the same thing with this widow here in Mark chapter 12. Most people would not have noticed her. They would have judged her based on all of these external factors, and yet she is the one that Jesus highlights. He notices her, he sees her. She's the one that grabs his attention, and he looks at her and loves her offering. And he says that her offering was worth more because of what was happening in her heart. And so what does this mean for us? I want to suggest that at least one of the things it means is that as we learn to follow him, you and I, on a daily basis, in just these very ordinary, everyday moments of our lives when we're not sitting together in church, like as we're walking home today, or as we're going to the picnic that I hope you all come to, or as we're going to the grocery store later in this week, or parenting our kids, or navigating friendships and relationships and roommates and all the thousands of things that we do in any given week, that in all of these things, that we would learn to place a higher value on God's values over our cultures. That as we sit with God each day and spend time with him and get to know him and get to know his voice and get to know his word, that we would learn to value what Galatians 5 calls the fruit of the Spirit. Things like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Like these are the values that we begin to hold up as the things that we want going on in our hearts, the things that matter most to God. Interestingly, even secular social commentators are seeing the need for these kind of characteristics. Even if you wouldn't call yourself a follower of Jesus, they're seeing how important these characteristics are in a culture today that often goes after all the other things like status and appearance and money and success. David Brooks is a New York Times journalist, and a few years ago he published an article, and I want to read to you just a snippet of it. It says this. He writes, "It occurred to me that there were two sets of virtues, the resume virtues and the eulogy virtues. The resume virtues are the skills you bring to the marketplace, but the eulogy virtues are the ones that are talked about at your funeral, whether you were kind, brave, honest, or faithful. Were you capable of deep love?" Some of you might know that when we began The Way in 2020, we also, at the same time, began a national ministry called Canadian Church Leaders Network. That's CCLN for short. You may have heard us talk about it, but we work with pastors, and one of the things that we sometimes do at CCLN in working with pastors is have them write their eulogies. And the reason for this is simple. There's this question behind it of who do you want to be? Like when your life is over, when you come to the end of your life, what do you hope will be said of you? It's an interesting practice, and it's not just for pastors. I encourage you all, if you get in the kind of headspace time with God, to do this if you want to. But it's this idea of like, what is the telos of your life? Who are you becoming? What will be said of you one day? What will people say of your life? Oh, he had a lot of money. She had some great cars. His job was impressive. Her house was really clean. Like you could name any number of things. And none of those are necessarily bad things. But my guess is that, like me, you probably wouldn't care much about those. Not really. Not really. That when all is said and done, your hope for your life is probably that the sum total of your life is not just simply what our 21st century culture says matters. Like I hope that one day when my 4 kids bury me, they'll be able to say something like, Mom was not perfect. Maybe she cried a little too much and got frustrated and distracted sometimes, and maybe she didn't cook the best, okay? But man, she sure loved Jesus. And the longer she followed him, the more she became like him. The older she got, the more generous she became, more patient. She was slower to anger, softer around the edges. That she was kinder, less critical, more relaxed, more compassionate. And because she loved Jesus most, she loved us really well. Those are the things that I hope could be said of me one day. I am not there yet, but one day. And I'm sure many of us would want to be a version of that kind of person. Those are the things that we would want said of us. But as I've been thinking about this week, it's just occurred to me over and over again, like none of us become that kind of person accidentally. We don't just wake up one day and go, wow, I'm a really well-formed human being that follows Jesus in all the ways, and here I am, more patient, kind, gentle. So, we don't become this way accidentally. we don't begin to value his ways, or we don't begin to value his value system above the culture's value system just accidentally. Because it's not only a decision to follow Jesus. We do make a decision to follow him, and I think that this is good news for all of us. It's not just a decision to follow him, it is also a process. The word for that would be sanctification. In other words, it takes a lifetime of learning and unlearning some things. It takes a lifetime of learning. This is the long pilgrimage. It's the long obedience in the same direction. And it is a process of learning to treasure what he treasures more than what our world treasures. It takes sitting with him, and again, it takes getting to know him and getting to know his word. And I also think it takes being in community, being around other followers of Jesus who are also committed to learning and leaning into Jesus' ways and values and his metric system. Because his values, God's values, are not just different than ours. They are fundamentally better than ours. They are better than ours. So that's the first thought. And here's the second thing I want to suggest that this story shows us. What's in our hearts impacts what's in our hands. What's in our hearts impacts what's in our hands. Look back at verse 43 and 44 with me. It says this: calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on." In the New King James Version, I like how it phrases it. It said that she gave her whole livelihood. Her whole livelihood. And this story implies that this woman had a great trust in God to provide for her. And because she had great trust in him, it didn't paralyze her into having a poverty kind of mindset, even though she was in fact experiencing a very real poverty. Her heart posture impacted then what was in her hands. In other words, she didn't just say she trusted God, she actually trusted him through her actions. Because consider, there was no plan B for her. There was no family to call for money. There was no savings account. There was no a little extra tucked away. There was nobody to borrow from for her next meal. She gave all she had in this moment. It wasn't much, but she gave it all. And there's this reality here that even after she gave the 2 coins into the offering receptacle, that she still had God. She had him. She valued him more than the 2 pennies that she put in. And she trusted him with it. She trusted him with her life, with her livelihood. And so the question, again, that I've been sitting with this week as I've been preparing is, who or what am I trusting to provide for me? And I want to invite you into that wrestle. Who or what are you trusting to provide for you? Some of us have lived long enough to know that jobs can be lost, that contracts can end, interest rates can rise, companies can go bankrupt, spouses can make poor financial decisions that impact us, marketplaces can crash, investments don't always pan out, governments fail, leaders fail, people fail. Many of us in this room have experienced one or multiple versions of those things. And here's what's interesting is that actually some scholars believe that this woman did as well, because just moments before she throws her 2 pennies into the offering, Jesus is actually in the temple teaching. And so in just the few verses right before the scene, I want to back up and read Mark 12:38-40. So right before she throws her offering in, this is the scene that happens. Jesus is in the temple teaching, and this is what he says: "Watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely." So Jesus is saying that somehow the teachers of the law, the ones who are, they're kind of like the preachers of the day, they were somehow devouring widows' homes. So he says this, and then right after that, he gets up and he goes and he's watching people put their money into the offering receptacle, and this poor widow comes in and gives her entire livelihood. So the question is, could she be one of the widows that Jesus was talking about just moments before? Could this be an illustration that he's using, like a real-time illustration? Could she have been one of those who was dealt with unfairly by teachers of the law? Maybe. Maybe. We're not 100% sure, but maybe. It would make a lot of sense given the context, and some scholars argue very strongly for that. And so if this is the case, and here's what I was thinking, if this is the case, then this story is even more amazing, because what it means is that she was still trusting God even though she'd been wronged by men of God. It means that she didn't write off God even though she had been mishandled by the very ones who should have handled her best. And I don't know, it feels like we're in a moment in the global church over the last several years where we are seeing church leaders, or we have seen church leaders falling left and right, and people are left behind and they're hurting. And as a leader in the church, I'll just say that it is sad and it's sobering. But because of these failures, it is arguably easy to understand those people who would get disillusioned by the church or choose to leave the church because of corrupt church leaders or because of leaders who hurt them. So then if as a number of scholars argue, that Jesus is using her as an illustration of somebody who is faithful, even though she has not been treated fairly, then this is just brilliant. And like, what a message for us in our day, because I too have been disappointed by leaders. People have let me down and it's felt unfair and overwhelming. And these kinds of times test what's in our hearts, not just in the church, even outside of the church. These test what's in our hearts, that test and reveal what we've been building on, for better or for worse. And in times of disappointment and disillusionment, prioritizing Jesus' way can seem very counter to our own understanding of what should be done. Sometimes retaliation feels best. Sometimes holding back or storing away feels right rather than giving away. And in this story, this woman, this poor widow, it's likely that she has been let down. Yet she still comes and she gives everything, almost as a declaration that she was still choosing to throw her weight on the living God, that her heart was set on him. And therefore, her posture, her heart posture, impacted what little was in her hands. And it's the same for us. Whatever is going on internally will impact, whatever going on in our hearts will impact what we do with what's in our hands. And to be clear, I think this text is about so much more than money. It's far more about our worship. What we do with our time, our talents, our resources, our skill set, it has to do with all of it. And when Jesus is the one that we love most, when he's the one that we're prioritizing, when he's the one that we're running after, when he's the one that we've got our eyes fixed on, then it impacts every single thing in our hands. It's much easier to be generous with our time and with our talents and with our resources when our eyes are fixed on the one who created generosity, who is generosity embodied. When our eyes are fixed on him, when our hearts are so enraptured with Jesus, with the living God, then the world and its worries, they will just naturally have less of a hold on us. The culture and its value systems will just seem less important to us because, like this woman, we will have thrown our weight on the living God. And not just say that we trust him to carry us, but actually trust him with what's in our hands. Riley, you can go ahead and make your way up. As we begin to close, I want to share one quick story with you that I was thinking about this week. I have a daughter. Her name is Macy. She's in the 3rd grade. And this year, her class has been raising money for an orphanage. And so throughout the year, we would get notes and emails from her teacher kind of reminding us as the parents, because the kids didn't do it so often, like, hey, could you send in some money? And kindly asking, would we please consider giving? And so throughout the year, I'd occasionally give Macy like a loonie or a toonie. Sometimes I'd give her like actual bills to take to school. But it was always our money, which is fine. Happy to give it, happy to. But one day, a few months ago, Macy came to me very excited because she'd gotten a $5 bill for her birthday. And so she had, unbeknownst to me, she had put the money in an envelope and decorated, put all her best stickers and all the things on it. And she wrote on the front, she brought it to me, and on the front of it, it said, "For the orphanage from Macy." She had put all of her birthday money into that envelope. And she was so excited about it. She was just smiling. She's got these huge dimples, very cute. She had this huge dimpled smile. She was just so excited to show me. She's 9. I mean, she knows the value of $5. She knows it wasn't much, but she gave it anyway. And as her mom, I mean, like, of course, like, I was crying already. I was like, I'm just so proud of you. I teared up. But here's what I told her. I told her, you know what, Macy, I think that this money from you makes God happier than all the loonies and the toonies and the money that Dad and I have given this year. Because God sees your heart, and I think he just loves it. And of course, she just kind of smiled and was like, okay, whatever. But I was thinking about this story this week because I got to kind of experience this to a degree, you understand. But from a parent's perspective, from a mom's perspective, I got to experience the joy of watching my daughter giving all she had, not out of compulsion, not because anybody forced her hand. We hadn't even talked about it. It was just out of sheer joy. Here, I want to give this. And I think it's the same for us. That God so delights in it when our hearts are in this posture of just joyful giving. And even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, I think like a proud dad, he delights in us when we bring him what we've got and we trust him with it. He delights in us when we trust him with everything that we have, when we value what he values. And again, that's done over a lifetime. We learn. We learn what he values. We unlearn what the world values. And when we trust him, our hearts get impacted, and then it immediately impacts everything in our hands. And I pray that that's the kind of people that we would be.
Well, thank you for listening to today's sermon. And hey, if you want to get connected with the church or learn more about us, you can find out more online at our website. It's thewaychurch.ca. Thanks again for listening. God bless.